Now we're in James chapter 4, verse 15. Reading from the King James Bible. Quote, "For that ye ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that." Unquote. I took a look at the other versions of this verse as far as translations, and pretty much the same. So let's just move on to the Greek parsing. For that. Well, I looked up to see, does James use this any other place? And then it dawned on me, let's look at the definition of this. So when we looked at the definition, it means this Greek word in this way it's used, instead of. So instead of, ye ought to say. So let's look at ought to say. That Greek word is only used twice this way in the Greek New Testament. It's used here, and it's also used by Luke in chapter 12, verse 12. Reading from the King James Bible, quote, "For the Holy Ghost shall teach you in the same hour what ye ought to say." Unquote. Okay, ought to say, looking up the definition, is to speak. To parse this out, it's said in the present tense, so now. Active voice, so they're talking about you doing it. And the infinitive mood. And the infinitive mood is, in most cases, corresponds to the English mood, infinitive. You just put the letter T-O in front of the verb. So we have that here. Ought to say. Continuing on. If the Lord will. Now it's parsed out will. It's the aorist tense, so it's characterized by the emphasis on the action and not with the concept of time. It's the active voice, so the subject is the doer, the performer of the action. And the subjunctive mood, which is the mood of possibility or potentiality. So let's move on. The Lord will, we shall live. So let's look at the Greek word for we shall live. This Greek word is used twice in the Greek New Testament, once here, and then Paul uses it later in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4, reading from the King James Bible, quote, "For though he was crucified through weakness, yet he lived by the power of God. For we also are weak in him, but we shall live with him by the power of God towards you." Unquote. Okay, looking at the Greek word for we shall live and getting the understanding of it, it's basically what this phrase here says. We shall live, so we're living. This is written in the future tense, so that is meaning, corresponds to the English future, indicates the contemplative or certain occurrence of an event which has not yet occurred. Active voice, so that means you, and indicative mood is stating a simple fact. Continuing on. We shall live and do. Now, the Greek word for this is in the future tense, active voice, so you, and indicative mood again, so that it's talking about a fact. And do this or that. Now let's look at John Gill's commentary on this particular verse and see what he has to say. Quote, "For that ye ought to say," unquote. Instead of saying we will go to such and such a place and do this and that and the other thing, it should be said, quote, "If the Lord will, and we shall live, and do this and that," unquote. The last, quote, "and," unquote, is left out of the Vulgate, Latin, Syriac, Arabic, and Ethiopic versions. And the passage renders thus, quote, "If the Lord will and we shall live, we will do this," unquote. So that here are two conditions of doing anything. The one is, if it should be agreeable to the determining will and purpose of God, by which everything in the world comes to pass, and into which the wills of men shall be resolved and resigned. And the other is, if we should live, since life is so very uncertain and precarious. And the sense is, not that this exact form of words should be always used, but what is equivalent to them, or at least that there should be always a sense of these things upon the mind, and there should be a view to them in all resolutions, designs, and engagements, and since the words are so short and comprehensive, it might be proper for Christians to use themselves to such a way of speaking upon all occasions. We find it used by Apostle Paul frequently, and even by Jews, heathens, and Turks. It is a saying of Ben Sira the Jew, quote, "Let a man never say he will do anything before he says, 'If God will,'" unquote. So, Cyrus, king of Persia, when under pretense of hunting, he designed an expedition into Armenia, upon which an hare started and was caught by an eagle, said to his friends, "This will be a good or prosperous hunting to us, if God will." And very remarkable are the words of Socrates to Alcibiades, inquiring of him how he ought to speak. Says Socrates, "If God will," and says he in another place, "But I will do this and come unto thy house, if God will." And it is reported of the Turks, for they submit everything to the divine will, as the success of war or a journey or anything, even of the least moment, they desire to be done, and never promise themselves or others anything but under this condition, "If God will." End of Don Gill's commentary on James 4, verse 15.